Hi, my name is Dr. Corey Miller. Welcome to this episode of Thoughtful Christianity, the vodcast of Ratio Christi, a campus apologetics evangelism ministry on 150 campuses in the U.S. and abroad, reaching both students and professors. In this episode, we will be discussing, as a matter of historical fact, how Darwinism influenced Hitler and contemporary white nationalism. My guest this time is historian Richard Weikart, whose field of expertise is modern European history, intellectual history. He's a professor and former department head of history at Cal State University Stanislaus. Dr. Weikart is author of several relevant books, and those are very fascinating, even the ones that aren't directly tied into this, but somehow I still see the connection. But Hitler's religion, Hitler's ethic, the Nazi pursuit of evolutionary progress, from Darwin to Hitler, evolutionary ethics, eugenics, and racism in Germany. Socialist Darwinism, evolution in German socialist thought from Marx to Bernstein, and his newest one that'll be the focus of this vodcast, Darwinian racism, how Darwinism influenced Hitler, Nazism, and white supremacists or white nationalism. Dr. Weikart, welcome to Thoughtful Christianity.
Yeah, Corey, thanks for having me on.
You bet. It's been a long time coming. I've seen some of your books out there and wanted to get around to this, but now is as good a time as any, I suppose. So apparently you know a thing or two about Hitler and about Darwin and about combining Hitler and Darwin. Tell us about the recent book here and specifically how this book differs from your other books. There's a lot of similarity, but this one is unique.
Yeah, first let me actually tell you how I got interested in this topic, because it's kind of interesting. Because when I first was doing my dissertation on socialist Darwinism, I was looking at how Darwinism impacted German socialists, and I wasn't thinking about anything relating to Hitler. In fact, I actually was not interested in doing anything about Hitler or Nazism at the time because I thought that too much had already been done on it, and that I really wouldn't be able to make a contribution there. So I was looking more late 19th century intellectual history in Germany. But as I was working my dissertation, I noticed that there were a lot of German Darwinists, or at least some, who were trying to use evolutionary ethics to replace Judeo-Christian ethics, as well as any other kind of ethics like Kantian or utilitarianism or whatever. So I decided to make my next research project about evolutionary ethics in Germany in the late 19th century. And what I found was that a lot of the people who were promoting evolutionary ethics by the 1890s, especially in early 1900s, were also promoting eugenics, scientific racism, and other ideas. And so I started realizing these things do sound a lot like Nazi ideology. And so I started asking myself, did Hitler embrace evolutionary ethics? And the more I then read in Mein Kampf and other of Hitler's speeches and other things, I started finding, Hitler actually did embrace a kind of evolutionary ethics. So that's how I got interested in the topic itself. And then that book that I was researching at that time, which became From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany, which came out in 2004, was looking mostly at the pre-1914 period and looking at how German Darwinists in that time were interpreting Darwinism, promoting racism, promoting euthanasia, eugenics, and other things. So the new book that just came out is a sequel to that, and looking at the Nazi period itself. Of course, the last chapter does look at white nationalism, sort of brings the story up to today, so it's how these impacts are still happening. But the bulk of the book is about the Nazi period itself, to show that indeed the Nazis were embracing these ideas. Because I did, by the way, get some pushback by a few historians. Most of them admit that Hitler was a social Darwinist, but I did get pushback from a few historians. So I wanted to, make it pretty clear.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked in your book how you talked about getting pushback. It wouldn't seem like there's much of a platform to stand on, but evidently there is for some.
And most historians, especially those that are well informed about the Nazi period, do admit that Hitler was a social Darwinist. And I haven't got a lot of pushback from historians writing about Nazism specifically, but a historian of science named Robert Richards at University of Chicago is the one who's been giving me the most pushback. His specialization is 19th century German Darwinism and such, but he doesn't really know that much about the Nazi period. And it shows in the book that he wrote about Was Hitler a Darwinian, where he argues that Hitler was not a Darwinian, but his arguments are completely unconvincing. And I completely demolish them in this book.
Hmm. Well, let's discuss the historical idea of struggle for existence and then action. I learned so much in reading this book. I think I've only read one book on Hitler before, but nothing like this. Being struck right out the gate in the introduction. And I was captured by some things that, well, we all went through the first high school bombing a couple decades ago. And I remember I was a youth pastor at the time, and all the high schoolers were sobbing, even though we were 2 states away from Colorado. But I learned some stuff here. It was spring of 1999, a Denver suburb, the day April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday. Wow. An 18-year-old white nationalist, Eric Harris, donned a shirt emblazoned with natural selection before heading off to high school. For weeks, he had been preparing a special event in honor of the Fuhrer. Some of this stuff it kind of blew me away. I didn't see the connection. I knew he had talked about Darwin, atheism. Cassie Bernal was a famous Christian martyred, evidently that day, because she was affirming that she was a Christian. But this was pretty interesting right at the beginning of your book. And then throughout the book, there was this expression, struggle for existence. And that's when I finally made the connection with Hitler's Mein Kampf, my struggle. And then, recently recalling Darwin's longer title of The Origin of the Species being the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life. That struggle narrative, it's hard to say for anyone to say that there's no connection here. So is this belief, this struggle for existence, this Darwinian motif, is this belief more widespread than we realize today? And if so, what are its implications?
Yeah, as you're suggesting, the notion of struggle was, of course, central to Darwin's conception of his natural selection. That's how natural selection happens. It's happening by competition between different species, but not just between different species. Darwin claimed that the most intense competition was within a species, which means that if you turn to humans, and Darwin in his book Descent of Man does talk about humans, the most intense struggle that we have among humans is with other humans. And Darwin believed, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, Darwin believed that races were groups of people that were locked in struggle, and that this struggle would lead to the extermination of those that were less fit, and then the survival and reproduction of those that were more fit. So this is a central feature of Darwin's theory. In fact, that's what makes his theory Darwinism rather than some other evolutionary theory, this notion of the struggle for existence. Hitler and other thinkers in the late 19th century, and Hitler was not unique in this, and Hitler was not, in fact, original in most of his thinking. A lot of Darwinist thinkers in the late 19th century, and this is what I detail in my earlier book, From Darwin to Hitler, began taking that idea and suggesting then that struggle was a good thing because it brought about evolutionary progress. And so in some sense, they thought it was a good thing for there to be warfare, for there to be economic competition between individuals. But this is all, by the way, competition to the death, because, of course, the unfit lose out by dying and or not being able to reproduce. And so this motif of struggle is extremely important in this early Darwinian thinking that we often refer to as social Darwinism. And then Hitler was going to pick up these ideas and was going to claim that struggle, and Hitler thought the racial struggle was the most important kind of struggle among humans, and was going to make that sort of the centerpiece of his ideology. But then, of course, in the time since then, these ideas don't just go away. The struggle for existence is still a part of Darwinian thinking, although I should say there's a lot of Darwinists today who sort of are schizophrenic in their beliefs about the struggle for existence, because they don't want to apply it to human society, just like Karl Marx didn't, by the way. They don't want to apply it to human society, so they just sort of ignore it when it gets to human evolution. But they claim that this is how everything has come about through other processes. But I think it's basically an untenable view to think that these things created all other organisms, but humans we somehow ignore it there.
Right.
They won't deny it. They'll still say that the struggle for existence is there, but they really don't want to talk about it when they talk about social policies or things like that. There are, however, as I detail in the last chapter of this book, a fringe groups, white nationalists, alt-right, sometimes the terms used, neo-Nazis, those terms are sort of overlapping categories, who still are believing this notion of racial struggle and who still do make it a central part of their worldview. And I think there is, unfortunately, I think there is a logic to it that does lend itself to winning people over, because if you believe that there's a human struggle for existence and it's bringing about higher evolutionary potential, then you have to ask, who is the fit, who's the unfit, and the fit survive. And if you define those as races, which the white nationalists do, and as Darwin himself did, and as the Nazis did, then you come up with this idea that you have racial struggle, and that's really the most important driver of evolution and bringing about progress.
Right. And that notion of progress, I can imagine it's not just some of the groups that you had mentioned at the end of your book, but probably even in groups within transhumanism. Well, so you're a historian. I can't help but think of George Santayana's quote that comes to mind: "Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it." When I was over in Germany, I remember, following up to a concentration camp. We were following a bus with a lot of high schoolers in it. And our tour guide said, yes, they take their high schoolers up there quite often because they want them to see their history and not to repeat it. And then one of the camps that we went to, an extermination camp, it's where they have the, I think it's in Berlin, the police academy, so that they remember the abuse of authority, the potential abuse of authority. Well, in this case, and along the line of thinking, one objection to your view is that, well, so what? Okay, Christians do bad things too. They have throughout history. Why blame Darwinism here for the maniac Hitler? In fact, some have tried to tie the Hitler to the other worldview, to Christianity. So just because Hitler cut loose on a good idea, why try to make such a big deal out of this? What's the point of your scholarship here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that in addition to thinking about Darwinism impacting racism, which is sort of the main focus of this particular book. In some of my other scholarship, I've also looked at the way that Darwinism impacted other kinds of ideas, like ethics, evolutionary ethics, and such. And so, excuse me, while we may not today ideas about Darwinian racism may be fringe ideas among white nationalists and such, there's other more mainstream ideas about Darwinism that does end up devaluing human life in other ways. And so in my book, From Darwin to Hitler, where I look at the early phases of Darwinian thinking about eugenics and euthanasia and abortion and other kinds of issues that have to do with life and death, the Nazis were going to use those ideas to implement their euthanasia, so-called euthanasia program, their T4 program that killed 200,000 Germans with disabilities. Today we may be opposed to racism as the intellectual elites anyway in our society, and as a culture we may be pushing away from racism in a lot of ways. But there's other ways that we allow Darwinism to devalue human life too, because if we are simply the chance product of eons of development, then many Darwinists themselves today readily admit, and this is not just something I'm throwing at them, it's something that they admit. People like Jerry Coyne, evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago, he's retired. People like Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, of course, one of the most famous atheists in the world today. They admit that if we are just the product of evolutionary processes that didn't have us in mind, then human life has no meaning. It has no purpose. There was no goal to bring us about. And so there's no basic value of humans. We're just an accident. To use Bertrand Russell, who was one of the most famous 20th century British philosophers, to use his turn of phrase, he said, we're just an accidental collocation of atoms. That's all we are. And so we may not be faced with exactly the same situation as, say, looking at, say, Hitler's racism or something, and we may be intensely anti-fascist, anti-Nazi and such, but yet there are other ways that we've devalued human life to bring us into a society where we have easy acceptance today among intellectual elites of abortion and infanticide and euthanasia and other issues. So I think there's different ways that we've allowed these devaluing of human life things to creep in through this, through Darwinian ideology.
Okay. And I want to get into sociobiological evolutionary ethics in just a minute too. But can you define for our audience what social Darwinism is, and then maybe tease that out a little bit in its relation to sociobiological evolutionary ethics? I think a lot of people may not even know what that term is.
Sure. Social Darwinism is the idea that we should apply Darwinism to society by strengthening competition. And social Darwinism could happen in two different levels. One level is individuals competing against each other within society. And so this would be generally considered economic competition. So this is sort of laissez-faire capitalism, okay. Right? Mm-hmm. So people who are justifying laissez-faire capitalism on the basis of Darwinism, it would be social Darwinists. And they're arguing that individuals should have, should be able to compete freely, and the fit should be able to survive and thrive and everything, and then the unfit can perish. That would be social Darwinism on the individual level.
Okay.
But there's also then social Darwinism on the level of societies, and that would be the way that nations or races in competition with each other. And so those kind of social Darwinists would see races, exterminating other races and such at the same time. Now, many people who are social Darwinists embrace both of those, that individuals within society should be in competition and that there are societies in competition. In fact, if we look at Hitler's worldview, he did believe both of those to be the case. Darwin himself believed in both of those to be the case. So there's not, you don't have to choose one or the other, although it should be said that some Darwinists do emphasize one of those more than the other. Now, interestingly, most social Darwinists tend to be biological determinists, which mean that they believe that biology or heredity determines human behavior and what we are as humans and human society and culture and such. Now, the interesting connection with sociobiology and evolutionary ethics today is that they are also biological determinists. Now, many people who embrace evolutionary ethics today do not necessarily embrace a dog-eat-dog kind of struggle for existence ethos, because many of them claim that we've evolved cooperative instincts. And so we've evolved to have morality and ethics and such. Now they don't have any selection. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is it kin's selection?
Yeah, they argue that on the basis of kin selection and also reciprocal altruism. Those are the two ways that they think this has happened. Kin selection just means that you sacrifice your life for your brother or your parents or someone else that then reproduces the genes that are really similar to your genes. So evolutionary ethics then says we evolve these cooperative and cooperativeness and morality and such in that way. So they don't necessarily think that you're stuck with this ethos of struggle necessarily, but still they see even that morality as being a tool in essence of the struggle for existence at some level. In fact, Darwin himself, interestingly, when he talked about the development of cooperation, said that he thought that people develop morality because they were learned to cooperate, say, within a tribe of people, and a tribe that would cooperate would have an advantage over a tribe that didn't cooperate, not only in sort of maybe getting more food stuffs, but also in warfare, that they would be able to essentially kill the other tribe off by being more cooperative. So even those that are arguing for cooperative instincts are still generally arguing that this is somehow giving us an advantage in the struggle for existence.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned just a minute ago, again, the struggle for life, the struggle, Mein Kampf. And you said some people take it as we should do that in, race relations or something like that. That's where white supremacism comes in, or maybe white nationalism, or certainly Nazism or others. But that should or that ought versus an is, that's where some would balk and say, okay, look, This is where you're fine being a historian, just sharing the fact that some guy and his group went rogue on Darwinist ideology, but it doesn't follow that he ought to do that, or anything follows from a moral ought from Darwinism. And I'm looking at Michael Roos, as you know, in sociobiological evolutionary ethics. He defines ethics a collective illusion of the genes, and he talks about this naturalistic fallacy that you can't derive an ought from an is. But that's a disputed idea. Number one, you have other atheists, Darwinists, who don't operate on the sociobiological level as collectivists, but like Ayn Rand, as an individual, right? The Virtue of Selfishness is one of her books, where all biological life seeks for one thing and one thing only: survival of the fittest. And therefore, whatever enhances that survival is good, whatever detracts from it is evil. And that's where she would see the Christian morality, maybe like Nietzsche did, as sort of weak. So she would be one that kind of disagrees with that a little bit. But one of the books I remember that I had interviewed Michael Roos, for example, since he's one of the leaders of sociobiological evolutionary ethics. It was a book that came out a number of years ago on a natural history of rape, biological basis of sexual coercion, where the essence of the book by a couple of evolutionary biologists is that the strongest male in any population seeks to perpetrate as many females as possible in order to perpetuate their DNA. So perpetrate in order to perpetuate. And they got all kinds of flack from feminists saying, this is wrong. And they're saying, wait a minute, we're not saying it's right. It's just an indicative. It's just a historical fact. Not that we ought to do it. Thank nature that we don't have to anymore. But this is why rape has an explanation, right? Well, the fact of the matter is that you do have people that do take indicatives, and it is an open question whether you can derive an ought from an is in philosophy. And when I asked Michael Roos at Purdue, I moderated a debate between him and John Hare. I asked him about this, and I said, is rape wrong? And he says, yes. So I said, is it absolutely, objectively wrong? Because you go on record saying there is no objectivity in ethics. He couldn't say yes. So culturally, sure, it's wrong. But that culture can turn overnight when it seems to be advantageous, perhaps, right?
Sure. Interestingly, I was at a conference in 2009, which was the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And so this is the conference on Darwinism. And one of the speakers there gave a little talk and said essentially, basically he talked about the black widow, how the black widow spider, the female, devours her mate after mating. And he said, it's just a flip of the coin that this isn't what we are like. There's this chance event that we aren't like that too. And he said, if we were like that, he said, all of our religious and moral systems would justify that and would, be in sync with that biological fact of humanity. So, yeah. And Roos, of course, you are alluded to this already, but Michael Roos said famously that morality or ethics is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. So if morality is just an illusion, he's wanting to live. He still wants to live by that illusion. He doesn't want to completely dispense with morality. He thinks it's a good thing, and everything, but he doesn't have any basis for considering it objective. So even many of those people that you're talking about who object and say, well, this is just indicative, it's not, really, there's no objective, there's nothing, that we don't have to follow that. They themselves are actually very often dispensing with any kind of objective morality. So essentially anything would go, and so when they have to try to deal with someone like Hitler, they don't really have an argument against Hitler. In fact, I've talked to people, and it doesn't happen very often, but I've had a few conversations with people where I've asked them the Hitler question, when they've talked about believing in relative morality. And I'll say, well, what about Hitler? Was he right? Was he wrong? Was he evil? Was he? And I had a philosophy graduate student. In fact, at that same conference I was telling you about in 2009, at that same conference, there was a philosophy graduate student who told me that Hitler was neither right nor wrong because there is no objective morality. And he kind of didn't feel comfortable with that. And I said, well, what do you do about that? And he said, I don't like Hitler, but
emotivism.
There's nothing objectively right or wrong about him.
Right. Yeah, or wrong. Yeah, and so there might not be any imperatives in nature. There are no commands, but there are no prohibitions either. It all just depends on might makes right. And this is what brings us back again to this idea of survival of the fittest, and where you can see that I don't think this is going to stop at Hitler. And in fact, it didn't. And that's why we had that Columbine High School and why we get some of the, the white nationalists and other people, white supremacists, and anyone who adopts this ideology. It was used in slavery for quite some time as well, right? So, turning this dial just a little bit, so much to talk about here. I'm reasonably well read in Marx. I'm even published in Marxist thought, but I found myself looking at this book and noticed that, you had written on Marx before too, which I was happy to see. Interesting to make the connection. But I found myself in comparative thought on Hitler and Marx throughout, the leaders of Nazism and Marxism. It seems like, Hitler's always the bad guy. Marx somehow gets a pass, or Marxism and communism today get a pass, but everyone wants to besmirch the Nazi, and for good reason. But let's discuss some of the brief comparisons of Nazism and Marxism, aside from, both being totalitarian. So first of all, Hitler was about elitism, right? Superiority, the Aryan race, and so forth. Marx was about egalitarianism, or equality. And we hear this as like the only virtue alive today in our culture is equality. Marx, like Hitler, appreciated Darwin's writings, but for different reasons. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, Marx and Engels both appreciated Darwin's writings primarily because they saw it as destroying teleology. That is the idea that there's purpose in nature. And so they saw it as a support for an atheistic worldview. And so they saw this as a good thing, that it basically undermined religion. That's really the key point that Marx and Engels are going to take away. In fact, Marx did not like the struggle for existence idea of Darwin. And he actually, in his correspondence with Engels, suggested that maybe another alternative kind of biological evolutionary theory might have more merit. That's a view that no one is really familiar with today. It was a guy named Pierre Trémaux, a Frenchman, who posited that the geologic conditions of various places were what caused evolution of biological species. So Marx didn't really like the struggle for existence idea. Of course, Hitler, the struggle for existence idea was central to his thing. And by the way, let me go back up and say this. That actually is why a lot of Marxists in the late 19th century, and this is what my dissertation was on, embraced Lamarckism, which was the idea that there's the inheritance of acquired characteristics, not hard heredity like Darwin had posited, that was then passed on over through competitive struggle. So anyway, Hitler embraced the idea of racial struggle. Interestingly, though, Marx did have a notion of struggle. And in fact, Hitler actually made a comment about this at one time. Hitler claimed that the main difference between his ideology and Marxism is that Marxism believes in class struggle and Hitler believed in race struggle. And that is one of the key differences between them. Marx, with his class struggle, believed that everything's based on economics. Everything's based on the economic system. Yeah. And so it's all about class struggle going on. Hitler, however, thought that it's all about racial struggle. So it's all about racial identity.
And what's fascinating, where we're at in our culture right now, I just got a new book yesterday by James Lindsay, the atheist, or now agnostic, used to be neo-atheist, but with neo-Marxism coming in, people are starting to wonder about the survival of the fittest civilization now. Where neo-Marxism seems to be every bit as preoccupied with race today as neo-Nazism does. And so his book is called Race Marxism, whereas, classical was, class Marxism, right? Mm-hmm. So right. For different reasons. I got the impression also in your book that the Nazis, along with Hitler, or at least a great number of them, and I wonder what the connection is, were not materialists, but pantheists of sorts, whereas Marxists are often seen to be materialists. Do you find this to be the case? And if so, why?
Yeah, when I did my investigations of Hitler, it became clear to me that he was venerating nature and really exalting it to be God. And if you look at the way that he talks about nature in Mein Kampf, for example, he does make it out to be a God that is, and when he uses the term God, sometimes he uses the word nature interchangeably in the context. It's very interesting. There's some passages like that that are very striking. But if you look at how he thinks about morality too, Hitler thinks that the way to be moral is to follow nature's laws, and he thinks the most important nature's laws is the struggle for existence. So Hitler embraced a view of pantheism. At least that's the closest I think we can come to pinning him down. He, is a little slippery in his ideas about religion, and he did occasionally make comments to try to appease his society by claiming to have some kind of Christian beliefs. But if you look at all those comments that he made positive about Christianity, they all came before he came to power, and were clearly aimed at his society and culture and trying to win them over. In fact, we know that he had private conversations at the same time where he made negative comments about Christianity, but publicly he tried to, look like
he was a good politician, successful politician.
Exactly. Yeah, he was a consummate politician. Yeah, he was playing to the people. And he even said this one time to Martin, who was it? No, it was Hess, Rudolf Hess. When he was in prison in Landsberg in 1923 to 24, he even actually had a conversation with Rudolf Hess where he told him that we need to, not alienate people over religion. We need to be careful about that, and not, get into that topic. So he just tried to avoid the topic for the most part, or occasionally make little comments positive toward it. So Hitler was clearly not in line with Christianity. And in his monologues later on, and Himmler in his, not Himmler, Goebbels in his diaries, Rosenberg in his diaries makes very clear that Hitler often was making anti-Christian statements. And it's very clear to anyone who's interested in looking at it. Marx, so again, but not against God. Hitler never denied that there was a God. Hitler never claimed to be an atheist. In fact, he very often spoke negatively about Marxism because it was atheistic. And so he saw that as being a negative thing about Marxism. Marxism, of course, Marx himself said that religion is an opiate of the people, opiate of the masses. Marx saw religion as being a part of the class struggle also. So for Marx, religion is just a way for the bourgeoisie to oppress the proletariat. So what you do as a bourgeois, or earlier the aristocracy when they were in charge, whoever the ruling class is, you promise the oppressed class pie in the sky by and by so that we can oppress you in the here and now. So that's basically how he's interpreting religion.
Right. So today, we often think that Nazism is dead. We thought, I think, Marxism was dead too when you saw the 1989 Berlin Wall fall and the Tiananmen Square. And then that exact same year, 1989, was the year critical race theory got its start formally in America. So, when the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, most of the neo-Marxists were Jewish and global socialists, not national socialists. They had to get out of here and they went to America. So we thought Marxism was dead. It wasn't. Sometimes we think Nazism is dead, but it's really not in some respects. Talk to us about contemporary white nationalism. We hear that term in the media. The media seems to associate it with racist conservative Republicans. That's what it means to be a white nationalist, right? A conservative Republican. What is a white nationalist? Are they around today, really?
Yeah, and often they'll associate it too, by the way, with evangelical Christianity. In fact, there were several books that came out just last year by prominent scholars with university presses that were arguing about the Christian roots of white nationalism. NPR consistently plays this theme as well, that white nationalism is a product of evangelical Christianity and such. White nationalism is the idea that races are unequal and that we should support our own race.
We
and
ought.
So,
There's that ought again.
People who are themselves white who are supporting it, obviously. And they're saying we should support our own race and our own racial identity in the struggle for existence against other races. And what's interesting, if you investigate, and I did a good deal of looking at the white nationalist websites. And when I say white nationalist, by the way, neo-Nazi, white nationalist, alt-right are really overlapping terms to describe these people. And if you look at their websites and you look at the materials that they publish and such, they overwhelmingly are anti-Christian, and they overwhelmingly are very pro-Darwinist and believe that Darwinism proves their racial inegalitarianism. They believe that the Darwinism is really a fundamental point that they think is sort of scientific proof of racism. And so they actually recycle a lot of the same ideas that Hitler and the Nazis would. That's why some are called neo-Nazis. They're recycling a lot of those same ideas. In fact, they're even recycling the idea about how whites became superior to, say, Black Africans. And the basic reason that they claim is that whites grew up in a climate that caused more selective pressure.
So
they had to, in order to grow up in the ice ages in the areas around Norway, Sweden, Denmark, northern Germany. They had to be very resourceful. They had to, have a higher intelligence. They had to be more cooperative with each other to survive. Whereas they said the Black Africans are in the tropics, they can just lounge around and do nothing, and just pick their food off the trees, and so they don't have to really think very hard. They don't have to work very hard. They don't have to cooperate and such. And so they claim that these selective pressures in the Darwinian struggle for existence made the white race superior to, say, the Black Africans.
Yeah, I've got, I mentioned Michael Roos earlier. Something else that came out of when I was reading yours, I had to pull these books off my shelf, right? Because he's one of the top scholars, got about 50 books, and probably 30 of them are on Darwinism. We had him here at Purdue, as I mentioned, and then he did a contributing chapter in one of my books, His Faith in God, Reasonable Debates in Philosophy, Science, and Rhetoric. But one of his recent books out, you've probably seen it, is Darwinism as Religion. And this is looking at literature, what literature tells us about evolution, almost a poetic story told through various literary authors about the takeover from Darwinism over teleology and other things. But just the title of that resonated with what I was reading in your book when you talked about how even Anton LaVey in the Satanic Church imbibed some of the thinking of some of these authors of white nationalists who are all embracing of Darwinism as the one who tells us where we came from, where we're going, and not just indicatives, but almost imperatives, what we ought to be doing to further the human race. To what extent do you think Darwinism is religious?
Well, it does answer some of the same questions as you just alluded to there, some of the same questions that religion is looking at. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? And of course, it's possible to pair Darwinism with a variety of different religious positions, theistic evolution or atheism and such. But ultimately, Darwin does answer a lot of questions that formerly people got their answers from religion. And ethics is one of those that we've already talked about some here today. The fact that where did ethics and morality come from? Well, the Christian answer, of course, is that ethics and morality is rooted in God's nature. At least that's my understanding of it. That it's rooted in God's nature of love, and so it's beneficial to humans, but essentially it's rooted in a theistic. We rooted in a theistic worldview. Evolution says that at least many of those embracing evolution claim that ethics have simply evolved over time as organisms have cooperated with each other and such. And there's some people thinking put those two things together. I'm not convinced of that. But essentially, it's then just a chance process that's brought about, whether organisms cooperate or not. And what this would mean, by the way, is that different organisms could have different moralities, and that morality, the human species could have been different 100,000 years ago and could be different 100,000 years in the future as well, if there is that much time for the human species in the future. So there's no objective morality about it. So it does answer a lot of questions. And Darwin himself, if you think about Darwin, his wrestling with some of these issues, Darwin himself recognized that there was conflict between his conception of, evolution of ethics and the Judeo-Christian conception of ethics. But another thing that Darwin did too, and that also many Darwinists do today, is that they actually try to explain religion itself by the Darwinian process too. And so religion is defined as being something that has simply come about because of Darwinian processes. And so there's a sort of a cottage industry in that element too, among at least some evolutionary biologists.
Right. Well, you've spent decades in the university, mostly at the same university, at least as a professor. And you had different universities that led up to that, from Iowa to, I think, was it Texas Christian University, which I don't know if they are a Christian university or not, but the title is
no.
They all once were, right? From Harvard and Columbia.
No, they were founded as one. They were founded as one, yes.
So
and they're still they're affiliated with the Disciples of Christ, which
calls
itself the Christian Church. So that's too where they get the name in there.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, that's enlightening. But you've been there for quite some time. You've been a student of it and a professor of the university. You've made the case, we've talked about here, that ideas have consequences and they're not all inert or indicatives. Some of them come with oughts, or if there is no worldview that provides them with oughts, there's nothing inconsistent with taking those indicatives and doing whatever you think serves your own advantage. So what are your thoughts about a ministry like Ratio Christi related to the university and culture itself?
What we see lots of young people who come into the universities, and very often they're not prepared for what they find there. And so I think it's very necessary for us as Christians to try to prepare people for young people for their entry into the university, and then Ratio Christi, then once they're at the university, to be able to encounter the ideas that they're getting there, because there's a lot of Christian ministries that don't sort of really tackle head on the ideas that people are getting. They just sort of ignore them, or go different ways. And what I really appreciate of Ratio Christi is that they do tackle head on these issues and try to show Christians that we do have good reasons to believe the things that we believe, and that we can stand up in the marketplace of ideas and not be ashamed, and be able to proclaim boldly the truths of Jesus Christ. So I think it's really tremendous that we get this kind of apologetics. I don't know by experience in terms of Ratio Christi. I don't think they have a chapter on my campus, not that I recall.
No, we're kicked off your campus. We're kicked off all of Cal State campus.
Well, yes, that's true. Yes, I understand that. And there's another issue that we need to fight, this cultural battle. Because a lot of campuses, a lot of secular universities are not wanting to give religious freedom to groups on campus. So that's all the more reason we need to be there one way or the other.
Yeah, and we don't ask what would Jesus do when it comes to litigation. In this case, we say, what would Paul do? Well, he would litigate the heck out of someone and give them continuing education on the U.S. Constitution, and we do that. Well, I appreciate the time here. I want our viewers to, again, see the book, listen to the podcast, or see the vodcast, as it were, Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. A lot of other books like that by Professor Weikart that you can find on Amazon or off of his website. Thank you so much for taking time with us, Richard. Appreciate you joining the cause and fantastic writings and research.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you.